The year was 1800, and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, was a quiet, pastoral landscape dotted with small farms, quaint villages, and dense woods. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the people of Lancaster were busy preparing for the long, cold months ahead. Little did they know that an unimaginable horror was about to descend upon their peaceful community. It began with whispers and rumors, spreading like wildfire through the towns and farms. People spoke of strange figures seen lurking in the woods at night, of animals found dead and mutilated, and of a coldness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the land. The older folks dismissed these stories as mere superstition, but the younger generation couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The first death occurred on a chilly October night. Joseph Miller, a well-respected farmer, was found dead in his barn. His body was pale and cold, and his eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The local doctor, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, was baffled. There were no signs of violence, no visible cause of death. The townspeople were frightened, but they carried on, hoping it was an isolated incident. But it was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more and more people fell ill with a strange, wasting sickness. They complained of feeling cold, of a terrible hunger that could not be satisfied, and of nightmares filled with shadowy figures and death. Dr. Cartwright did his best to treat the sick, but nothing seemed to work. The victims grew weaker and weaker until they eventually died, their bodies as cold and lifeless as Joseph Miller's. Panic began to spread through Lancaster County. People locked their doors at night and kept their children close. The church was filled with frightened parishioners seeking comfort and answers. Reverend James Thompson preached of God's wrath and the need for repentance, but even he seemed uncertain. Then, the unthinkable happened. One night, Joseph Miller's body disappeared from its grave. The next morning, his wife, Mary, was found dead in her bed, her throat torn out as if by some wild animal. Those who saw her body swore that Joseph himself had come back from the grave to kill her. The dead were rising, and they were hungry for the flesh of the living. As more graves were disturbed and more bodies found, the people of Lancaster realized they were facing an epidemic of the undead. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, but the undead were relentless. They clawed at doors and windows, driven by an insatiable hunger. The once peaceful county was plunged into chaos and terror. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson, along with a small group of brave townsfolk, decided to fight back. They armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find and set out to hunt down the undead. They discovered that the creatures could be killed by destroying their brains or setting them on fire. It was a grim and bloody task, but they were determined to save their home. The battle raged for months. The once picturesque landscape of Lancaster County was scarred by fire and death. Many brave souls were lost, but slowly, the living began to gain the upper hand. By the spring of 1801, the epidemic had been contained, though at a terrible cost. The survivors tried to rebuild their lives, but Lancaster County was forever changed. The memories of that dark time lingered, and the graves of the victims were marked with special symbols to ward off evil. The story of the undead epidemic was passed down through generations, a chilling reminder of the horrors that had once plagued their land. Despite the initial victory, the people of Lancaster County remained vigilant. The horrors they had faced were too fresh in their minds, and the sense of unease lingered like a dark cloud over the community. Each year, as autumn turned to winter and the nights grew longer, the fear would return, whispering in the cold wind and rustling leaves. In the aftermath of the epidemic, Dr. Samuel Cartwright and Reverend James Thompson became unlikely leaders in the community. Their bravery and leadership during the crisis had earned them the respect and trust of their neighbors. They worked tirelessly to restore a sense of normalcy, but they both knew that something fundamental had changed. One night, as the first snows of December fell gently on the rooftops, Dr. Cartwright sat by the fire in his study, reading through his notes on the epidemic. He had meticulously recorded every detail, hoping to find some explanation for the horror that had befallen them. As he read, a soft knock came at his door. "Come in," he called, expecting one of his assistants or a late-night patient. Instead, Reverend Thompson entered, his expression grave. "Samuel, we need to talk," the Reverend said, taking a seat opposite the doctor. "I've been hearing things, strange things." Dr. Cartwright nodded, setting his notes aside. "I have as well. People are still seeing shadows in the woods, hearing whispers at night. It's as if the land itself is haunted." Reverend Thompson leaned forward, his voice low. "I fear it may not be over. The evil that caused the dead to rise, it could still be here, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to return." The doctor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "But what can we do, James? We've burned the bodies, sanctified the graves. We've done everything we can to prevent it from happening again." Reverend Thompson shook his head. "Not everything. There are ancient texts, forbidden knowledge, that speak of such plagues. We need to understand what we're dealing with. We need to find the source of this evil and destroy it once and for all." Over the next few months, Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson delved into research, poring over old books and manuscripts. They consulted with scholars and mystics, seeking any clue that might lead them to the truth. Their search took them far from Lancaster County, into the libraries of Philadelphia and the darkened halls of New York's secret societies. They learned of ancient curses and dark rituals, of necromancers who had the power to raise the dead and bend them to their will. One name kept appearing in their research: Elias Thorne, a notorious sorcerer from the 17th century who had been rumored to possess the power of necromancy. According to the records, Thorne had been executed for his crimes, but his body had never been found. With this new lead, Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson returned to Lancaster County, determined to uncover the truth. They began searching for any trace of Elias Thorne or his followers. Their investigation led them to an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place shrouded in legend and fear. The farmhouse was in ruins, its windows broken and its walls covered in ivy. As they approached, a sense of dread washed over them. They forced the door open and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The air was thick with dust and decay. In the basement, they found what they had feared: an altar covered in strange symbols, surrounded by the remnants of dark rituals. Old tomes and scrolls lay scattered about, filled with forbidden knowledge. Among them was a journal, its pages yellowed with age, bearing the name Elias Thorne. As they read through the journal, they discovered the terrible truth. Thorn had indeed mastered the art of necromancy, and he had cast a powerful curse upon Lancaster County, binding the spirits of the dead to his will. The epidemic was not a random occurrence but a calculated act of vengeance from beyond the grave. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson knew they had to act quickly. Using the knowledge they had gained, they prepared a counter-ritual to break the curse. It required great courage and precision, for a single mistake could doom them all. On the night of the winter solstice, under a full moon, they gathered in the basement of the farmhouse. With them were a handful of brave townsfolk who had agreed to help. The air was charged with anticipation and fear. As Reverend Thompson began the incantation, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their lanterns. Shadows seemed to come alive, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Dr. Cartwright and the others held their ground, chanting in unison as they followed the Reverend's lead. The ritual reached its climax, and a blinding light filled the room. The ground shook violently, and for a moment, it seemed as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and the room fell silent. The curse was broken. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences in Lancaster County ceased. The dead no longer walked, and the shadows in the woods seemed less menacing. The people began to rebuild their lives, slowly but surely putting the horrors of the past behind them. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson continued their work, forever vigilant against the forces of darkness. They knew that evil could never be truly vanquished, only held at bay. But for now, at least, peace had returned to Lancaster County. The year was now 1845, and Lancaster County had enjoyed many years of peace since the dreadful events of 1800. The community had grown, the fields were fertile, and the townsfolk went about their daily lives with little memory of the horrors that had once plagued them. But the land had not forgotten, and deep in the shadows, an ancient evil stirred once more. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, now an elderly man, still resided in Lancaster County. Though retired, his mind remained sharp, and he continued to study the occult in his spare time. Reverend James Thompson had passed away years earlier, but his legacy lived on through his grandson, William Thompson, who had taken up the mantle of the local pastor. One chilly autumn evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the fields, a stranger rode into town. His clothes were unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen, modern yet worn, as if he had traveled from a place far away. At his side, a large revolver glinted in the fading light. The stranger's name was Johnny Vanjik, a man from a future they could not fathom, carrying a weapon that should not exist. Johnny dismounted his horse and walked through the main street, drawing curious and wary glances from the townspeople. He made his way to the local inn, where he hoped to find lodging and perhaps some answers. As he entered the inn, the innkeeper, Mr. Amos Wright, looked up from his desk. "Evening, stranger. Haven't seen you around these parts before. What brings you to Lancaster County?" Johnny tipped his hat. "Just passing through, looking for a place to rest my head for a few nights. Name's Johnny Vanjik." Mr. Wright nodded and motioned to the register. "Sign in here, Mr. Vanjik. Room's $1 a night, and supper's at 7. As Johnny signed the register, Mr. Wright couldn't help but notice the revolver at Johnny's side. "That's an unusual piece you've got there," he remarked. "Never seen a gun like it?" Johnny glanced down at his .44 Magnum and gave a wry smile. "It's a family heirloom," he said, not wanting to reveal the true nature of his weapon. "Been in the family for generations." Mr. Wright chuckled. "Well, it sure is a mighty fine piece of craftsmanship. Never heard of a .44 Magnum round, though. Must be something special." Johnny nodded, his mind already drifting to the reason for his visit. He had been drawn to this timeline by a disturbance in the multiverse, a ripple of dark energy that he couldn't ignore. He suspected it was related to the events of 1800, and he intended to find out more. The next morning, Johnny visited the local church, hoping to speak with Reverend Thompson. As he approached, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench outside, reading a book. It was Dr. Samuel Cartwright, still vigilant after all these years. "Good morning," Johnny greeted him. "I'm looking for Reverend Thompson. Is he around?" Dr. Cartwright looked up, his eyes sharp and inquisitive. "Good morning to you as well. Reverend Thompson is inside. May I ask who you are?" "Name's Johnny Vanjik," he replied. "I'm a traveler, here to investigate some unusual occurrences." Dr. Cartwright's eyebrows raised slightly. "Unusual occurrences, you say? You have my attention, Mr. Vanjik. I'm Dr. Samuel Cartwright. Perhaps we should speak further." Johnny nodded, sensing a kindred spirit in the old doctor. "I'd like that. But first, I'd like to pay my respects to the Reverend." Inside the church, Reverend William Thompson was preparing for the day's service. He looked up as Johnny entered, noting the stranger's presence with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Good morning," Johnny said, removing his hat. "I'm Johnny Vanjik. I'm here to seek your guidance and perhaps some answers about the past." Reverend Thompson approached, extending his hand. "Welcome, Mr. Vanjik. Any friend of Dr. Cartwright is a friend of mine. What brings you to our humble church?" Johnny shook his hand, then explained briefly. "I'm here because I believe there may be a resurgence of the dark forces that once plagued this town. I need to understand what happened in 1800 and how it was stopped." The Reverend's eyes widened slightly. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Vanjik. But if Dr. Cartwright believes there's something to it, then so do I. Let's sit and talk." Johnny, Dr. Cartwright, and Reverend Thompson gathered in the church's study, where Johnny recounted his knowledge of the undead epidemic and his own experiences traveling through different timelines. The two men listened intently, their expressions growing graver with each passing moment. "The disturbances you've sensed," Dr. Cartwright said thoughtfully, "they align with some strange occurrences I've noted in my own studies. There have been reports of shadowy figures in the woods again, whispers of a coldness returning to the land." Reverend Thompson nodded. "And I've heard similar tales from my congregation. People are starting to feel uneasy, as if the land itself is warning them." Johnny leaned forward. "Then we need to act quickly. If the evil that caused the undead epidemic is returning, we have to stop it before it gains strength." Together, they devised a plan to investigate the source of the disturbances. Dr. Cartwright would use his knowledge of the occult to identify any signs of dark rituals, while Reverend Thompson would rally the townsfolk and provide spiritual guidance. Johnny, with his .44 Magnum and his experience fighting the undead, would lead the charge against whatever darkness they might face. Their first destination was the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the same place where Dr. Cartwright and the original Reverend Thompson had discovered the dark altar all those years ago. As they approached, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding filled their hearts. Inside, the farmhouse was much as it had been left, a ruin of broken furniture and decayed walls. But in the basement, they found new signs of activity. The altar had been disturbed, and fresh symbols were scrawled in blood on the walls. "This is recent," Dr. Cartwright said, his voice tense. "Someone has been here, trying to revive the old curse." Johnny stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his .44 Magnum. "Then we need to find out who and stop them." As they searched the basement, they found a hidden passage leading deep underground. The air grew colder and more oppressive as they descended, and the walls seemed to close in around them. At the end of the passage, they found a large, cavernous chamber lit by flickering torches. In the center of the chamber stood a figure cloaked in darkness, chanting in a guttural, ancient language. Surrounding him were the undead, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figure turned as they entered, revealing a gaunt, pale face twisted with hatred. "Elias Thorne," Dr. Cartwright whispered, recognizing the sorcerer from the old records. Johnny drew his .44 Magnum, aiming it at Thorne. "This ends now." Thorne laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You cannot stop me, time traveler. The curse will be reborn, and Lancaster County will fall into darkness once more." Reverend Thompson stepped forward, holding his Bible high. "In the name of God, we will banish you and your foul creatures from this land." Thorne raised his hands, and the undead surged forward. Johnny fired his .44 Magnum, the powerful rounds tearing through the undead with ease. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson recited the counter ritual, their voices strong and unwavering. As the battle raged, Thorne's power began to wane. The combined strength of Johnny's future weapon and the ancient incantations proved too much for the sorcerer. With a final, desperate cry, Thorne was consumed by a burst of blinding light, and the undead crumbled to dust. The chamber fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the three men. They had done it. They had stopped the curse from returning and saved Lancaster County from another nightmare. In the days that followed, the sense of unease lifted from the land, and the townsfolk began to rebuild once more. Dr. Cartwright and Reverend Thompson continued their work, ever vigilant against the forces of darkness. And Johnny Vanjik, the time traveler with the mysterious weapon, became a legend in his own right, a guardian of Lancaster County and a protector of the multiverse. And so, life went on in Lancaster County, but the people never forgot the bravery and sacrifice of those who had fought to save them. They honored their memory by living their lives with courage and kindness, ever watchful for the shadows that might one day return. Though Lancaster County had once again found peace, the ripples of dark events in its history continued to echo through the generations. The community had grown stronger, more resilient, but always with a vigilant eye on the shadows that seemed to gather at the edge of the light. Years turned into decades, and the memory of Johnny Vanjik's heroics became part of local folklore. Parents told their children stories of the brave time traveler with the mysterious weapon who saved them from an ancient curse. The .44 Magnum, a weapon far ahead of its time, was a symbol of hope and resilience, though few understood its true significance. It was now 1865, and the United States was recovering from the ravages of the Civil War. Lancaster County, having been spared the worst of the conflict, was a haven for returning soldiers and families seeking to rebuild their lives. Yet, amidst the reconstruction, whispers of the past began to surface once more. One late autumn evening, a group of children playing near the old abandoned farmhouse came running back to town, their faces pale with fear. They spoke of shadowy figures moving in the twilight, of cold, unnatural winds that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. The townsfolk, remembering the old stories, began to worry. Dr. Cartwright, now an elderly man, could no longer aid them, but his granddaughter, Clara Cartwright, had taken up his mantle. Clara was a brilliant and determined young woman, well versed in her grandfather's studies of the occult and the supernatural. She had inherited not only his knowledge but also his courage and dedication to protecting Lancaster County. Reverend Thompson's grandson, Joseph Thompson, had also followed in his family's footsteps, becoming the new pastor of the church. Together, Clara and Joseph formed a formidable team, bound by a shared sense of duty and the legacy of their grandfathers. As the reports of strange occurrences grew more frequent, Clara and Joseph decided to investigate the farmhouse themselves. Equipped with the knowledge from Dr. Cartwright's old journals and the rituals passed down by Reverend Thompson, they set out to uncover the source of the disturbances. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the decrepit building, its walls now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the silence was almost oppressive. Clara and Joseph moved cautiously, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the basement, they found evidence of recent activity. The dark symbols had been redrawn, and fresh blood stained the altar. It was clear that someone or something had been trying to revive the old curse. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the gravity of their situation. "We have to stop this before it gets out of hand," Clara whispered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Joseph nodded, gripping his Bible tightly. "We need to perform the counter-ritual. We can't let this evil take root again." As they prepared to start the ritual, a sudden noise startled them. They turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a familiar revolver at his side. It was Johnny Vanjik, looking much the same as he had in the stories, despite the passing of 20 years. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice a mix of awe and suspicion. Johnny tipped his hat, his expression grim. "Name's Johnny Vanjik. I see you found the source of the trouble. I thought I had ended this back in '45, but it seems the past has a way of coming back." Clara and Joseph exchanged a glance, recognizing the name and the weapon from their grandfather's tales. "The .44 Magnum," Joseph murmured. "You're the one from the stories." Johnny nodded. "I'm here to help. We don't have much time. The ritual needs to be completed before the moon sets, or we'll be dealing with more than just shadows." With Johnny's guidance, Clara and Joseph began the counter-ritual. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to press in around them, but they kept their focus. Johnny stood guard, his .44 Magnum ready for any threat that might emerge from the darkness. As the incantations filled the chamber, the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light. The ground trembled, and a cold wind whipped through the room, but they did not falter. Johnny fired his weapon at the approaching shadows, each shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. The final words of the ritual were spoken, and a blinding light filled the chamber, just as it had 20 years earlier. The dark symbols burned away, and the oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. The curse had been broken once more. Exhausted but triumphant, Clara and Joseph turned to Johnny. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you." Johnny nodded, holstering his .44 Magnum. "The fight's never truly over, but for now, you've given this town a chance to breathe easy again." As they emerged from the farmhouse into the early morning light, the townsfolk gathered around, their faces filled with relief and admiration. Johnny Vanjik had once again saved Lancaster County, and his legend grew even stronger. But Johnny knew his work was not done. There were always new threats, new disturbances in the fabric of time and space. He bid farewell to Clara and Joseph, promising to return if ever the need arose. With a final tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode off into the horizon, leaving behind a community forever grateful and forever watchful. Years later, as Clara and Joseph grew old, they would tell their own children and grandchildren the story of the brave time traveler and his .44 Magnum, a symbol of hope and resilience in a world where the past and future often collided in unexpected ways. And so, life continued in Lancaster County, ever vigilant against the shadows, ever grateful for the courage and sacrifice of those who stood against the darkness. The legacy of Johnny Vanjik lived on, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who fought to protect their home and their future.